Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackson Cote. I'm a MassLive reporter, and I'm here today with Kirk Minihane of Barstool Sports, the former host of the popular WEEI sports radio show, Kirk and Callahan in Boston. He's also the host of Barstool's first ever true crime podcast, The Case, which is what we'll be talking about today. The Case takes a look at the disappearance of Jennifer Fay of Brockton, Mass. Her case has remained cold for more than 3 decades, but Kirk's podcast takes a fresh look at it. Kirk, thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
Good, Jackson. Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Now, before we jump into talking about the case and Jennifer's disappearance and all the details that come with that, I wanted to ask you quickly about some news that broke earlier this week. Your producer, Steve Robinson, announced on your show he'll be taking leave once the case finishes up. There are 2 episodes left of the case. What does this mean for the podcast?
Well, for the case, I mean, Steve, I think is moving on. He's looking to do something else, and he's going to kind of hit the open road. But for the case, for this season, not much. We're actually working. We're taking a break here from finishing up episode 7, which will be on Monday. And then we don't do my normal show, the Kirk Minihane show, next week. We're taking that off to finish it up. And then Steve's going to kind of help us out for a few more weeks and head out. But I do think Steve will have some role in some form or fashion going forward in season 2 and 3 and 4. He's been a great second guy, a great producer on this one.
I know you mentioned several times during the podcast how helpful that your producer
is. Yeah, just invaluable. So I mean, it's going to be hopefully he'll have some role in season 2 and 3. Like I said, I hope going forward.
Yeah, and your podcast provides a pretty exhaustive look at Jennifer's disappearance, and it touches on all these really dark subjects like violence against women, abuse of children, substance abuse. In Steve's announcement, he said he's just completely burnt out and taking this lead for mental health. How are you feeling? I mean, these are lots of dark subjects, and it's pretty extensive investigation you guys have been pulling together.
Yeah. Okay. I have my ups and downs normally anyway. It's not my favorite time of year, but yeah, I feel okay. I mean, I think, doing so much work to me has sort of helped in a way. But no, I feel okay, but I do think, for sure, I think so much of this story as well is about these people who have gone through this stuff, whether it's Jennifer's family or other family members. And when you talk to them, I mean, it's mental health toll it's taken on them is unbelievable. I mean, it's literally, absolutely, indisputably altered, in a lot of cases, just ruined their lives. They've never been able to come back from it.
And obviously, the main subject of this show is Jennifer Fay and her disappearance. But there's this overarching theme of violence against women, which is just really hard discussion points. But you guys pretty much tackle it pretty effectively. Mm-hmm. So this podcast, The Case, it's fascinating. You're reporting and researching into Jennifer's disappearance. You talk with law enforcement in both Massachusetts and South Carolina, friends and family of Jennifer, and even people of interest in her disappearance. Right now, The Case is one of the most popular true crime podcasts on Apple Podcasts. And like I mentioned before, it's Barstool's first ever true crime podcast. What was it like making that shift from, talking about sports and other, lighter subjects to taking on, something completely different, which is this investigation into a decades-old cold case? Any lessons learned so far?
Well, I mean, for sure. But I do think, so much of my career, even at EEI and here at Barstool, has been investigative in nature, asking questions, sort of breaking stories, pointing out things that we don't think are true, looking for falsehoods. So that sort of instinct is what brought me. And I've said this on my other show. I've been talking for years about pitching true crime ideas to people back at EEI, at Entercom. And then once I did it at Barstool, they were really supportive about it. I think what I've learned the most is that, when you do something like this, you have to be prepared to understand that 99% of the time it's going to be a dead end. Excuse me, all these phone calls are going to be dead ends. Leads you get, I mean, we get so many tips now and leads once we started this. So many of those but you have to look at every single one because you never know. And then even within the episode itself, a few episodes ago, in the middle of it, we kind of scrapped about 70% of it and started over. Like, I think one thing I've learned is sort of, you've got to be patient with this thing. We were talking before about other podcasts that have been successful, really successful, and have led to arrests and stuff like that.
Yeah, we talked about My Own Backyard, which looks at the disappearance of Kristen Smart in the 90s. I mean, that's all the way in California. Do you
Correct.
draw any inspiration on that? I mean, it
Sure.
has a similar
Yeah.
case, similar structure as you. They're looking at all these leads, some not successful, some more successful.
Absolutely. But I think, people seem to think, and I think because part of it is my persona where you sort of drum things up, that, we were going to do an 8-episode series and then we'd have the case solved by episode 8 and the people would be in jail and everyone would be vindicated, or, the families would be happy. It's not how it works.
That's not how real life works.
No. And, I think even after the trailer was released for the first episode, a person of interest was named sort of based off some of that down in South Carolina. So then it got ramped up even more. And when that happened, I was like, well, I'm glad that the police are looking at these things. But at the same time, I thought from a podcast perspective, that sets a real precedent that we're not going to be able to keep. Just it doesn't realistically work that way, like we talked about before. These things work really slowly. So I would imagine if something in fact does happen, it'll be 6 months from now, a year from now. It's just how it works.
Yeah, it's a slow pace.
Yeah, for sure.
These investigations are slow and take time, and sometimes, like in the case of Jennifer Fay and also Kristen Smart, they take decades. Now, to give some backstory into Jennifer's case, she went missing in November 1989 at only 16 years old. She left home for a party in Brockton and was never seen again.
Right.
You've talked with Jennifer's mom, Dottie, her sister Yvette, and so many other who believes not only that Jennifer's dead, but that her body is somewhere in Brockton or around Brockton. Why do they think that? And why do you think this isn't just simply a case of a 16-year-old girl running away from home?
Well, I just think the second part first, the runaway thing just doesn't really make sense. I mean, it seems really, we looked at it, we've talked about it, it's certainly a possibility.
You go into it in the first episode.
And we do some in the 7th. We do some in this upcoming 7th as well. And I think, it's just not, she would have resurfaced in some form or fashion. So we just didn't, nobody believes that. It doesn't seem like it's possible. They believe that she was in Brockton. They believe her body's still in Brockton. So do private investigators. So do some police. Because the suspects who they believe had something to do with this were Brockton people, or people who lived there, people who knew where to put things, people who knew maybe where to hide something, people who knew how to do that. So,
and when you say they believe this, are you talking about law enforcement and her family?
Her family, law enforcement, and private investigators who have worked on the case. Yeah.
Okay.
So, these are people involved at the time. Some are not in Brockton anymore. But at the time, did not spend a lot of time outside of Brockton. So if there was a body, whether Jennifer was killed, whether there's an accident, whether something happened with drugs. No, I think the idea is that people thought, let's get rid of this body as fast as we can. Where can we do it? And there are some, potential locations, and they're all, if not in Brockton, certainly within a, 5-10 mile area.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, you're sort of skeptical about this whole runaway theory. As part of the podcast, you talked with Ann Desmond, the Brockton police detective who worked Jennifer's case for nearly 10 years. Your interview with her is somewhat hard to listen to, I'm not going to lie, mainly because Ann Desmond continues to believe that Jennifer is still alive and that the night she went missing, she, sort of magically ran away with this man on a motorcycle and drove off to California in the wind. In the podcast, Jennifer's family legitimately scoffs at that theory. Can you talk about some of the early failures in the investigation and what your goals are revisiting the case?
Yeah. I think you covered that pretty well with Ann. I just wanted to bring attention to this case. Like I said, I'm not trying to be some knight who comes in and saves it. I think, I think the police from the beginning did 2 things, maybe 3. They looked at Jennifer as a runaway because she had run away before. Now, she'd done it for a few days here, a few days there. Her family always knew where she was. So not even really a runaway, but she would leave the house. She'd have battles with her mom. She'd go somewhere else. They did that. And then number 2, what I think they did was I think they looked at this family as less than. I think they looked at them as a mom who was out drinking that night, as a teenage girl who did drugs. And I think they judged them to some extent. And they didn't give it the same attention they would give somebody else. And I do think we spent some time on this, as I said in Monday's episode. I do think that's a thread that started with Ann Desmond that goes all the way down to the people working the case today. Not that they're bad people working the case today. They're not. We've talked to them. Yeah. But I think when you talk to them, the first thing they'll bring up to you every time is that Jen's mom, Dottie, was a big drinker at the time. And you say to them, well, is that in any way relevant to
I was about to ask it. How is that relevant at all?
Right. Is that why Jen went missing? No. But they just want us to know that for some reason. And I do think it's because the family, understandably, of course, has gotten a tremendous amount of sympathy while they've beat up on the police department. And I think the police department sometimes gets sensitive about that and tries to turn it around on them.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're doing that kind of stuff where it's like, why are we trying to solve this case? Like, why are we worried about this? Why are we in this?
Why are we worried about this person's alleged drinking problem?
Correct. I mean, again, if it was relevant,
that's not going to bring Jennifer back.
No, if it's relevant somehow to the case, great. But she wasn't at the house that night because she was at the bar. That's true. Mm-hmm. That's not why Jen went missing. That's not why somebody took Jen. I mean, she could have very easily been at a movie theater that night, or having dinner somewhere else, or visiting some other friend, or at a bookstore. It's just as relevant. So I do think, and it ties into South Carolina as well, I think there's this sort of, as I said, thread or thought process that these people are not less than, and I've said this a couple of times on the podcast, and it's true. When you watch 48 Hours, you watch Dateline, generally you see kind of blonde-haired, pretty girls, moms or college or sorority girls, and,
from affluent neighborhoods.
Yeah, right. Upper middle class or wealthy. Certainly that wasn't Brockton in 1989, and certainly it's not Walhalla in 2018 or all the way up to 2021.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, your reporting on Jennifer's disappearance brought you all the way to Walhalla, South Carolina, where you interviewed the last person several people say Jennifer was seen with, Kevin Mailer. Mm-hmm. His street name's Boston. And in this sort of funny moment in the podcast, funny or depressing, whichever way you look at it, you spend roughly like 10 minutes or more reading his criminal record, which is long to say the least. You also go into his abuse of women in detail, and he even agrees to sit down with you to do a polygraph interview about Jennifer's disappearance to try to clear his name. It's worth noting he's a person of interest not just in Jennifer's disappearance, but also the disappearance of Faith Roach, another missing person in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. Who is Kevin Mailer, and what was it like to interview him, interrogate him, talk with him?
Well, I mean, I interviewed him in person twice. We talked to him first or second time we went down to Walhalla. First time we went down, Steve? First time we talked to I think the first time we were in Walhalla, we talked to Kevin for like 10 or 15 minutes. And,
I didn't talk about going up, fearfully sort of going up to his trailer,
we didn't know as much.
And he welcomed you guys basically.
Right. And then we kind of communicated a lot on social media, which is what he does. This is his MO. He's still doing it now. He's on Twitter today and on Facebook today denying that he, was abusive to Diane Cool, who we talked about in episode 6, for example. Yeah. His daughter reached out to me on social media and called me a liar and said that Kevin's never done anything wrong. And this is what they do. And that's okay for her to do that. I understand. But so yes, we set up a polygraph with Kevin because Kevin was clear. He was saying to me for weeks, do this. I want to prove I'm innocent. I had nothing to do with Jennifer. I had nothing to do with Faith Roach. So I said, fantastic, great. We set it up. I went down. Steve, my producer, didn't go down with me. I went down by myself to Greenville, South Carolina, where it was administered. There was a lie detector. There was a polygraph examiner there as well. And again, the night before, he said, thank you so much. I'm going to clear my name. This is the biggest day of my life. And he got there. I had to leave because I wasn't going to be present for the examination. I got a call 45 minutes later. It was supposed to take about 2 hours. And the examiner said, I had to stop it. He fell asleep 3 times. So I couldn't legally give him the test anymore. I would lose my license. Mm. So, and then I wound up talking to him for an hour and a half. It was, I think, I think the podcast might be different than others because I don't think you get that very often where you get a one-on-one in the middle of a series talking to somebody,
a person of interest willing to sit down for a polygraph interview.
Right. And I think he's obviously a person of interest in both cases that we're really focusing on. Who I think he is. I just think he's somebody who grew up and then absolutely to defend him for a moment, an absolutely horrible upbringing. He bounced from foster home to foster home time and time again. I'm sure he was abused there. I have no question of that. But as an adult, I think he's just a pathological liar. I think he's a serial abuser of women. They've told me that. And I believe he knows more than he's told us about Jennifer going missing, Faith Roach missing, the death of Kevin Craig, and the death of April Jones. That's what I believe.
Have police told you that?
Police down in South Carolina have been more cooperative conversationally with us than police for sure in Brockton. The Oconee County has been much, much more cooperative than, say, the Brockton area. No question about it. No doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to talk with you about some of the other interesting people you interview in the podcast, mainly Diana and Natalie. Diana and Natalie has come after you on social media in the wake of you interviewing her. She's a resident of Brockton, longtime resident of Brockton. She's called you unstable and irresponsible, saying she's praying for you. You address this directly on your podcast, even telling listeners that if they Google your name, they can find many reports about the controversies in your radio career and battles with mental health. Were you expecting her to come after you? And can you just talk a little bit about Diana?
Yes, I did expect her to come after me because that's her historical MO. We've had people, dozens of people reach out to us and say that she's made up fake Facebook accounts and attack people. And this is sort of her thing. So I knew, at first we had an okay relationship. We talked a lot. She told me her side of the story. I never believed her. Just a quick backstory on her. She was arrested and pled guilty and went to jail for over 2 years for essentially enslaving a girl in her basement, first in Brockton and then in Halifax, Massachusetts, Rena Conrad. You can look it up. If you look up Diane Miller at the time and Rena Conrad, you'll see the whole story. It's awful what they did to her. Absolutely awful. And then I saw how
she lived right down the street from Jennifer.
Yeah. So she lived, maybe 150 yards from where Jennifer was. Jennifer's best friend at the time lived right across the street from Diana. And the last place that Jennifer was seen was right off of that same street. Again, probably 50, 75 yards away.
Yeah.
And she'd had issues with Diana and Jennifer. They had the battle. She's kind of combative. Jennifer was, kind of had a sharp tongue. She wouldn't take a lot of guff, and Diana didn't like that, I guess. So,
yeah. And this is in no way to say that she's absolutely linked to Jennifer's disappearance, but she does comment pretty extensively about Kevin Mailer on the podcast.
She certainly does, yeah. And she had a relationship with Kevin. But I knew Diana once the worm turned a little bit on her. It was episode 3 or 4 was Diana. I forget which one it was. I think maybe it was 3 or 4. I don't know. But she really went off on social media. And I knew she would. I knew it was going to be the same.
Yeah. And you say it's her prerogative.
Of course. Yeah. I'm not going to have her. Yeah. This is her social media. She can say whatever she wants. I've had a whole career of people doing that. She honestly fits in better with my other audience than she does with the case audience. So, it's nothing I haven't seen before. So I'm not that worried about it. And I think the more she talks, she's protesting a lot. That's what I would say. She's protesting a lot.
Yeah. And Kirk, I also wanted to talk about sort of the Massachusetts focus of the case. You grew up in Massachusetts, you've worked here for a long time, and you're now reporting on this, case largely out of Brockton. You said early on in the series that you wanted to center your show on Massachusetts and then discovered Jennifer's case in a Reddit thread. But before then, you didn't know anything about her. What has it been like learning about Jennifer's case?
It's, it's a good question in that, your stock answer is to say, this is, what it is horrible. But yet at the same time, you are kind of inspired when you see people like Yvette and Dottie and these people whose lives, they have to go on and live their lives and raise children and grandchildren, but they haven't given up. I'm tired doing the case, doing the case 7 days a week for us right now. But this is their life every single day. Yvette is working tirelessly. She's done it for over 30 years to find answers for this. So when I'm done with this series, it's funny. I was just talking to Yvette when I was grabbing lunch for me and Steve earlier on the phone about trying to get information about something else, and told her, we got 2 more episodes, but I'm not going away. I am not. The idea that when the case is done, the 8 episodes, well, we'll just move on and go back and do the show and whatever. I'm absolutely in until there's some resolution for this family. I just find it, inspiring and at the same time disheartening how they've been kind of kicked aside. And I do think of Van Desmond. I do think of the other police people in Brockton and how they treat it, and it does frustrate me. So yeah, so it's been sort of alternately, upsetting and inspiring, I would say.
Yeah, and I think just to myself how I don't know how you recover from losing a daughter or a sister.
Awesome.
And like we talked about before in the other true crime podcast, My Own Backyard, about the disappearance of Kristen Smart, the main sorrow for the family is the fact that there's no closure in the case. They've never found her. They've never found Kristen. And here, they've never found Jennifer.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. And like I said, I know, I say with people in South Carolina, and it's just, I always tell the story that, when I talk about this, my son Harry and I were at Barnes and Noble once. He was 2 or 3, if that. And I was going to grab a book up on the shelf. I looked down and he was gone. And he was gone. I wound up finding him over by the cookie section there. Maybe 2 minutes later, 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds were the scariest of my life. My heart was going to go out of my mouth. And they've lived like that for 30 years, and you're right. And here's
with no answers. No answers at all.
And here's the truth, without a confession or a body, it's going to be hard to get that answer. We're not going to stop. I know they're not going to stop. So they will at some point get resolution. They will get answers. I hope we help just a little bit to get there. I hope so.
Yeah. Well, they're from Brockton. They definitely have grit.
That's true. They definitely do have that.
Well, Kirk, I really appreciate you joining me today.
Sure.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about Jennifer's case, about your podcast?
No, just, it's every Monday. You can get it everywhere. We have 2 episodes left. It drops at noon, at the Case Podcast on Twitter. If you're looking to do that, we have a tip line there as well. And
you found on Apple Podcasts.
Everywhere. Yeah. Yep. Podcast is everywhere. And the feedback has been great. I know it's not for everyone. That's okay too. But yeah, we've got 2 episodes left. I think the 7th and 8th episodes, particularly the 8th, I think are really going to be pretty interesting. So I would definitely keep an eye on it the next few weeks. Interesting.
Good season finale.
I hope so.
Okay. Any plans to, just wanted to ask, any plans to look at any other cases, any potential other true crime series you're working on?
Yeah. Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, we're going to do more seasons. I signed a contract with Barstool recently. We're going to do two cases a year, we hope, going forward. We're already looking at some stuff for season 2, but we will always, if anything ever breaks or we get anything new, we will pop on and do an episode at any time for Jennifer and Faith and April and Kevin. And there are, I would also want to say this, people like Laura Anders and Tammy Stubblefield, who are in Walhalla and who are missing as well. There's an amazing amount of missing women in the Walhalla area. It's a population of about 4,000 or 5,000, and women have gone missing there for the last 2 or 3 years. And I've talked to Tammy's family. I've talked to Laura's family, and it's the same thing. And, you feel bad because you have so much time to do episodes. We're right now talking with the family of a boy, a young man who passed away from Walhalla a couple of years ago, and they're looking for answers. And they have raised some really interesting questions as well, particularly about the coroner in Oconee County. But right now, today, I don't have time to do that story, but I'm going to do that story at some point. So there's always, Steve was just pointing out a couple more tips to me during lunch. So it's sort of never ending now.
Yeah, there's never a shortage of missing persons cases in the United States.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, yeah. So we'll keep working on that. Yes, for sure.
Okay. Well, again, I appreciate you joining us, Kirk. Thanks for spending time with us, answering questions about Jennifer's case, about your podcast. And again, for anyone tuning in now, my name's Jackson Cote. I'm a reporter with MassLive. And I'm here today with Kirk Minihane of Barstool Sports, talking about the Case podcast that looks at the disappearance of Jennifer Fay of Brockton. Thanks a lot, Kirk.
Thank you, Jackson.